The first thing Clara Bennett noticed about him was his hands. Not his suit, though it was clearly expensive, the kind of charcoal grey that looked like it had been sewn directly onto his body. Not his watch, though it caught the morning light every time he reached across the table. Not even his face, which was sharp and still, in a way that made him look like he had been carved rather than born. It was his hands, perfectly steady, always wrapped around the ceramic mug she placed in front of him, as if the warmth of it was the only thing tethering him to the room. He came in every weekday at exactly 7:14 a.m. Clara knew this because she had been opening Birch and Grounds for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she had learned to read the rhythm of the morning the way a sailor reads the wind. The delivery truck from the bakery arrived at 6:45. The espresso machine needed 7 minutes to reach the right temperature. The couple from the apartment across the street, the ones who were always arguing but always holding hands, came in at 7:00, and he came in at 7:14. His name, she had learned from his credit card receipt on the 3rd visit, was Nathaniel Hale. She hadn't recognized it at first. She wasn't the type to follow business news or flip through financial magazines. But her co-worker, Daphne, had nearly dropped an entire tray of almond croissants when she saw the name on the small paper slip. Clara, Daphne had whispered, pulling her into the back room with the urgency of someone reporting a fire. Do you know who that is? A man who orders a black coffee and a plain croissant and tips exactly 20% every single day, Clara had said. Daphne had stared at her. That's Nathaniel Hale, as in Hale Capital, as in the man who bought 3 city blocks last year and turned them into that mixed-use development downtown. As in, Clara, he's worth something like $4 billion. Clara had looked through the small window in the kitchen door at the man sitting quietly at table 4, reading something on a single folded sheet of paper, and thought, he doesn't look like $4 billion. He looked like someone who was very tired and trying very hard not to show it. That had been 8 months ago. Since then, the routine had not changed. Nathaniel Hale arrived at 7:14, sat at table 4, always table 4, by the window that faced the small courtyard with the elm tree, and Clara brought him his black coffee and his plain croissant without him having to ask. She set them down. He looked up briefly, said thank you in a voice that was low and unhurried, and then returned to whatever he was reading or writing. He never used his phone at the table. He never brought a laptop. He always had paper, a legal pad, a folded document, a letter. Once, she had noticed the paper had handwritten annotations in red ink running up the margins, dense and precise. She had learned not to linger. He wasn't rude, not even close, but he had a quality of stillness that made the space around him feel like it required a certain respect, the way the inside of an old church did. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't interrupt unnecessarily. You came, you did what needed to be done, and you allowed the quiet to remain intact. The other regulars had theories about him. Gerald, a retired high school principal who sat at the counter every morning and considered himself the unofficial social historian of Birch and Grounds, was convinced that Nathaniel Hale was hiding from someone. Men with that kind of money don't come to places like this unless they're running from something, Gerald had announced one Tuesday, loud enough that Clara had to pretend to be very interested in the pastry display case. Daphne thought he was lonely. Look at him, she said once, tilting her head toward table 4 with the subtlety of a lighthouse. He comes in at the same time every day, sits at the same table, orders the same thing. That's not routine, Clara. That's ritual. People create rituals when they're trying to feel something consistent. Clara didn't offer her own theory out loud, but she had one. She thought he came to Birch and Grounds because it was the one place where no one wanted anything from him. She had noticed the way his shoulders dropped, almost imperceptibly, the moment he stepped through the door. The slight exhale, the way his jaw, which was set hard on the street outside, she had seen him through the window sometimes, walking toward the café from the direction of the parking garage, phone pressed to his ear, face closed and businesslike, softened slightly once he sat down. Birch and Grounds was not glamorous. It was warm wood and mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that Daphne rewrote every Sunday in her loopy handwriting. It smelled like espresso and cinnamon and the faint sweetness of the potted lavender near the door. It was, Clara thought, the kind of place that asked nothing of you. She understood that need more than she let on. Clara was 31 years old and had been working at Birch & Grounds for 3 of the most unplanned years of her life. She had a degree in art history from a state university that she was still paying off. She had come to the city, Portland, Oregon, rain-softened and green, after a relationship that had quietly collapsed under the weight of 2 people wanting entirely different things. She had taken the job at the Café as a temporary measure, the kind of decision you make when you need income and breathing room and something that forces you to get out of bed before 6 a.m. 3 years later, she was still there. This was not a source of shame, exactly. She loved the work in a way she hadn't expected to, the physical rhythm of it, the satisfaction of a well-pulled espresso shot, the small intimacy of knowing someone's order by heart. She was good at it. She was warm without being performative, efficient without being cold, and she had a memory for detail that made customers feel seen. She remembered that Gerald took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar and that he preferred to be greeted by name. She remembered that the young woman who came in on Thursday mornings, a medical resident who always looked like she was running on fumes, needed her oat milk latte with an extra shot and a word of encouragement, even a small one. She remembered that Nathaniel liked his croissant on the right side of the plate, not centered, and that he preferred when she didn't ask if he needed anything else. What Clara did not love, and tried not to think about too often, was the feeling that she was watching her own life from a slight distance, that she was very competent at living within a very small radius. On a Wednesday morning in early October, the radius shifted. It started with the elm tree. The courtyard outside Table 4's window had been unremarkable all summer, but the October cold had turned the elm from green to a burning, vivid amber that made the window look like a painting. Clara had paused for a moment when she passed it, genuinely caught by it, a warm ceramic mug in each hand, completely forgetting for 3 seconds that she was in the middle of a rush. She delivered Nathaniel's coffee and croissant at 7:16, 2 minutes later than usual because the espresso machine had needed a reset. And as she set the mug down, she said, without fully planning to, "The tree looks incredible today." She didn't know why she said it. She had never offered an observation to him before. It was the kind of thing you didn't do, not with him, not at Table 4, not within the invisible perimeter of his quiet. He looked up, not with irritation, but with a genuine kind of pause, as if she had said something unexpected in a foreign language that he actually understood. He turned toward the window and looked at the elm for a long moment. The amber light fell across his face. "It does," he said, and then, before she could retreat, "Do you always notice things like that?" Clara blinked. "Like what?" "Details," he said. "Small ones that other people walk past." She didn't know what to say to that. She had been asked many questions in 3 years of serving coffee. She had not been asked that one. "I think it's an occupational habit," she said finally. "You notice what people need before they ask for it, and eventually you start noticing everything." He studied her for a moment in that still, unhurried way he had, and then he nodded once and looked back down at his papers. Clara walked back to the counter. Her heart was doing something slightly irregular. Not because of who he was, she told herself, but because of the way he had looked at her, not as a fixture of the cafe, but as a person with something interesting inside her. Daphne materialized at her elbow immediately. "What just happened?" "Nothing," Clara said, and picked up the next order. But something had shifted. She felt it in the particular way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, a pressure in the air, a new current. Birch & Grounds looked the same. The elm burned gold outside the window. Nathaniel returned to his papers, and yet the morning felt different from every morning that had come before it. She would not find out until the following Tuesday exactly how different things were about to become, but that is the nature of change. It announces itself quietly, in a sentence about a tree, before it rearranges everything. The following Tuesday arrived with the kind of grey, insistent rain that Portland did better than anywhere else. Not dramatic, not violent, just a steady, patient presence that soaked into everything slowly and without apology. Clara had walked to work under an umbrella that had a small tear in one panel, which meant her left shoulder was damp by the time she pushed open the door of Birch & Grounds at 6:15 a.m., She didn't mind. There was something she had always liked about the cafe in bad weather. The contrast of it, the cold and wet outside, the warmth and smell of coffee and toasted bread inside, made the place feel more like itself, more necessary. Gerald arrived at his usual time and announced that his knee was predicting 3 more days of rain, which he considered more reliable than any meteorologist. Daphne came in at 6:30, shook the water from her jacket, and immediately began redrawing the specials board because the humidity had made the chalk smear overnight. At 7:14 exactly, the door opened. Nathaniel Hale stepped inside, shook the rain from his coat in 2 precise movements, and scanned the room the way he always did. Not anxiously, but with the measured awareness of someone who had learned to take stock of spaces before settling into them. His eyes moved to table 4. He moved toward it. Clara was already reaching for the ceramic mug. Everything was the same, and then it wasn't, because when she brought his coffee and set it in front of him, he looked up immediately, not after a pause, not as an afterthought, and said, with a directness that left no room for misinterpretation, "Would you sit with me for a moment?" Clara stood very still. The ceramic mug was already on the table. Her hands were empty. She had absolutely no procedural reason to remain standing there, and yet her feet did not move. "Sit with you," she repeated. "If you have a few minutes," he said. His voice was the same as always, low, unhurried, but there was something underneath it that she hadn't heard before, something that might have been, if she was reading it correctly, uncertainty. "I realize that's an unusual request." "It's a slow morning," she said, which was true. The rain had kept the usual wave of commuters away, and the cafe held only Gerald at the counter, a young woman working on a laptop near the door, and a couple sharing a scone in the back corner. Daphne caught Clara's eye from behind the espresso machine and made a face that communicated approximately 17 different things at once. Clara pulled out the chair across from Nathaniel Hale and sat down. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at his coffee, then at the rain-blurred window, then at her. Up close, closer than she had ever been, she could see things she hadn't noticed from the distance of a serving position. There were faint shadows under his eyes that good lighting usually concealed, a small scar along his jawline, thin and old, and the way he held his coffee mug, with both hands, not one, like he was drawing something from it beyond warmth. "You said something last week," he began, "about noticing details, about knowing what people need before they ask." "I remember," Clara said. "I've been thinking about it." He paused. "I run a company with 412 employees. I have advisors, analysts, a team of people whose entire job is to pay attention to information and tell me what matters. And somehow—" He stopped. "Set the mug down. I missed something I shouldn't have missed." Clara waited. She had learned in 3 years of bringing people their coffee that silence was not always an invitation to fill. Sometimes it was the thing a person needed most. "There's a project," he continued, "a mixed-use development in the Pearl District. 14 months of planning, significant investment, community approval process that took the better part of a year. We were supposed to break ground next month." He looked at the table. "We're not." "What happened?" Clara asked, and then immediately wondered if she had overstepped, but he didn't seem to find the question intrusive. "A building on the eastern edge of the site. I was told it was unoccupied. My team verified it twice. It has been unoccupied for most of the last 6 years. He picked up the mug again. "What no one noticed, what I didn't notice because I relied on reports instead of walking the site myself, is that for the past 14 months, while we were planning, a woman moved back in. Quietly, informally. She's 83 years old. She grew up in that building. Her family owned the unit on the 3rd floor before the building changed hands. She has no legal claim, but she's there. And when our site manager went to do the final walkthrough last week, he exhaled. There she was." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "What are you going to do?" Nathaniel looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than anything she had encountered in 8 months of watching him from across a cafe. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. "The legal answer is straightforward. The right answer is less clear." She thought about what he had said, that he was trying to figure out the right answer, not just the legal one. Something about that distinction felt important. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain shifted, coming at the window sideways now, and the elm tree in the courtyard bent slightly in a gust of wind. "Because you're the only person I talk to in the mornings," and he said, "and I think I've been needing to say it out loud." Clara absorbed that. The only person he talked to in the mornings. She thought about what Daphne had said. That's ritual. People create rituals when they're trying to feel something consistent. And understood, suddenly, that the ritual of table 4 and the black coffee and the plain croissant was not only about the cafe's simplicity, it was about her, about the specific, undemanding presence of someone who gave him what he needed without making it a transaction. Except this morning he had made it something else. He had made it a conversation. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you already know what the right answer is. Otherwise you wouldn't have used that word." He looked at her. "You said the legal answer is straightforward," she continued. "You didn't say it was the answer you were going to use, which means you've already decided something. You're not trying to figure out what to do. You're trying to find the courage to do it, even when it costs you something." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had just heard something true. "That costs me about 6 weeks and a significant contract renegotiation," he said finally. "I know," Clara said. "I'm sorry." A corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something more restrained than that, but related. "Don't be. It's not your fault I missed it." "No," she agreed. "But it's still a hard thing." He nodded, and then he picked up his croissant, which he had not yet touched, and pulled a small piece from it in the methodical way he always did, and for a moment they just sat there, Clara with her hands folded on the table, and Nathaniel with his coffee and his difficult decision, while the rain came down outside, and Gerald told someone on his phone that his knee was never wrong about precipitation. It was Daphne who broke the moment, appearing at the table with the professional cheerfulness of someone who had been watching from the espresso machine for the last 10 minutes and decided the universe needed her intervention. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Hale? Clara, table 6 is ready for their order." Clara stood. "I should get back." Nathaniel looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. And it was different from the thank you he gave her every morning when she set down his coffee. That was courtesy. This was something with weight in it. "Of course," she said, and went back to work. She moved through the next hour on autopilot, taking orders, steaming milk, sliding plates across the counter, while her mind circled back to the conversation with a persistence she couldn't quiet. It wasn't the story about the woman in the building, though that had stayed with her too. It was the thing he had said without quite saying it. "You're the only person I talk to in the mornings." Not, "You're a convenient ear." Not, "I needed to vent." The phrasing had been specific, deliberate. The kind of phrasing a man used when he chose his words carefully, which Nathaniel Hale clearly did. At 8:32, he folded his papers, left his exact 20% tip, and walked out into the rain. Daphne was beside Clara before the door had fully closed. "Okay," she said. "I need you to tell me everything." "It was a conversation," Clara said. "That's all." "Clara?" Daphne's voice was patient in the way that meant it would not remain patient for long. "That man has been coming here for 8 months and has never said more than 12 consecutive words to anyone. He just sat with you for 20 minutes. Clara looked at the empty table, the mug, the plate with its few croissant crumbs, the chair pushed back at the angle that meant someone had stood up from it and hadn't pushed it fully back in. "I know," she said. What she didn't say, what she was only beginning to let herself think, was that she had liked it. Not in a dazzled, starstruck way, not because of who he was or what he was worth, but because of the particular quality of his attention, the way he had listened to her with a focused stillness that made her feel like what she said actually mattered. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt that. And that, she thought, as she picked up the coffee mug and brought it to the back, was considerably more unsettling than anything else about the morning. The weeks that followed settled into a new pattern. different enough from the old one that Clara felt it every morning like a change in altitude, subtle but affecting everything. Nathaniel still arrived at 7:14. He still sat at table 4. Clara still brought his black coffee and plain croissant without being asked. But now 2 or 3 times a week he would look up when she set the mug down, and there would be a question in his expression. Not demanding, not assuming. Just open. And if the cafe was slow enough, she would sit across from him for 10 or 15 minutes before the morning rush made it impossible. They talked about small things and large things in the same quiet tone. He asked her once what she had studied in college, and when she said art history, he had not reacted with the polite blankness that response usually produced in people. Instead, he had asked which period interested her most, and when she said Northern Renaissance, the Flemish painters, the way they handled light as if it were a physical substance they could hold in their hands, he had been quiet for a moment, and then said that he had a Van Eyck reproduction in his office that he had bought at an auction years ago without fully understanding why, and that he thought he might understand now. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking through it, rather than looking at it from above. He had grown up in eastern Oregon, in a small town called Vail that most people had never heard of, the son of a man who ran a modest construction company and a mother who taught elementary school. He had not been born into money. He had built Hale Capital from a real estate investment firm. He had started at 26 with a business partner and a loan that had terrified him for 3 consecutive years. The business partner, a man named Robert Finch, had left the company 8 years ago under circumstances that Nathaniel described only as complicated, and Clara could tell from the brief flatness that entered his voice when he said the word that complicated was doing significant work in that sentence. He was 41 years old. He had been married once, briefly, in his early 30s, to a woman named Diane who was now a landscape architect in Seattle, and with whom he was, as far as Clara could tell, on perfectly civil terms. There were no children. He lived in a house in the West Hills that he described, with a self-awareness that surprised her, as being significantly larger than any single person needed. Clara, in turn, told him things she hadn't said to anyone in Portland, or perhaps anywhere, in a long time, about her degree and the gap between what she had imagined doing with it and what she had ended up doing, about the relationship that had brought her to the city, and the quiet grief of watching something end, not with a fight, but with a slow mutual recognition that 2 people had grown into shapes that no longer fit together. About the way she had taken the job at the cafe as a placeholder and then somehow never left, not because she was afraid of leaving, but because she had never found a clear enough reason to go somewhere else. "Do you want to leave?" he asked her one morning. Direct as always, but without any agenda underneath it. "I want something clearly," she said. "That's different." He had looked at her with that particular attention of his and said, "Yes, it is." The regulars noticed. Gerald, who noticed everything and considered subtlety an overrated virtue, told Clara one morning that she seemed lighter. "Like you've been carrying something heavy and put it down without realizing it," he said, stirring his single sugar into his coffee with slow deliberation. Clara told him he was projecting, and he told her that 68 years of paying attention to people gave a man certain advantages. Daphne said nothing, which was, coming from Daphne, practically a declaration. It was on a Thursday morning in late October, 18 days after Nathaniel had first asked her to sit with him, that the new pattern broke in a way Clara had not anticipated. She arrived at work at her usual time, went through the opening routine, and at 7:14 the door opened. But it was not Nathaniel who walked in. It was a woman, perhaps 50, in an impeccably cut wool coat, the color of deep burgundy, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of composed, assessing expression that suggested she was accustomed to walking into rooms and immediately understanding the power structure within them. She looked around the cafe with slow deliberation, and her eyes stopped on Clara. She walked directly to the counter. "You're Clara Bennett," she said. It was not a question. Clara set down the portafilter she was holding. "I am. My name is Sylvia Hale," the woman said. "Nathaniel's sister." Clara had not known Nathaniel had a sister. He had mentioned family in passing, his parents, both retired now and still living in Vail, but never a sibling. The omission felt suddenly significant, though she couldn't have said why. "He doesn't know I'm here," Sylvia continued with a precision that made clear she wanted that established immediately. "I'd like to speak with you, if you have a few minutes." Every instinct Clara had, built over 3 years of reading people across a cafe counter, told her that this conversation was going to be uncomfortable. But she was also, she realized, genuinely curious. And curiosity, in her experience, was harder to override than caution. "Daphne," she said, "can you cover the counter for a bit?" Daphne appeared with the speed of someone who had been listening. "Absolutely," she said, with a neutrality so studied it was almost artistic. Clara brought Sylvia to the small table near the back window, not table 4, deliberately, and they sat across from each other with 2 cups of coffee between them that neither of them touched. "I'll be direct," Sylvia said. "I know my brother has been spending time talking to you. He told me himself, which is actually remarkable, because Nathaniel doesn't volunteer personal information to anyone, including me." She paused. "Especially me." "We talk in the morning sometimes," Clara said carefully. "When it's slow." "I know." Sylvia's expression was not unkind, but it was watchful. "What you may not know is that Nathaniel has had a very difficult 18 months, beyond the business complications." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, the same gesture. Clara noticed with a small shock that Nathaniel used. His business partner, Robert Finch, was not simply someone who left the company. Robert was his closest friend for 15 years. What happened between them was a betrayal. Significant enough that Nathaniel spent the better part of a year closing himself off from nearly everyone. She met Clara's eyes. He's only just started to come back, to be present again, the way he used to be. Clara absorbed this, the complicated that had done so much work in that sentence. She understood it now. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you're part of why he's coming back," Sylvia said, "and I want to understand who you are." The honesty of it was disarming. Clara had expected a warning. "Stay away from my brother. You're not in his world. This isn't what you think it is." She had prepared herself for a version of that conversation. She had not prepared herself for this one. "I'm a person who brings him his coffee," Clara said, "and sometimes sits across from him and listens." "I know what you appear to be," Sylvia said. "I'm asking what you actually are." It was a question that Clara had been asking herself quietly for 3 years. Hearing it said aloud by a stranger in the back of her own cafe had the strange effect of making it feel less frightening. "I'm someone who is trying to figure that out," Clara said. "I think that's the most honest answer I can give you." Sylvia studied her for a long moment, and then something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "He hasn't laughed," she said, "in over a year. Not really, not the way he used to." She paused. "He laughed on the phone with me last week. He was telling me something you said about the rain." Clara tried to remember what she had said about the rain. She had said something offhand about how Portland rain was the meteorological equivalent of a passive-aggressive roommate, always present, never dramatic about it, but slowly getting into everything. "He thought that was funny," Sylvia said, and there was something in her voice that Clara recognized, because she had heard it in her own voice when she talked about things she had almost lost and then hadn't. Relief. "He called me to tell me, which is something he hasn't done. Called me just to share something small and good, in over a year." Clara didn't know what to say. Sylvia picked up her coffee, took one careful sip, and set it back down. "I'm not here to interfere," she said. "I'm here because I needed to see you, and now I have." She stood, buttoning her coat. "He doesn't know what he's walking toward. He's not the kind of man who lets himself know things like that before he's ready, but I think you probably already knew that." She left a folded bill on the table for the coffee and walked out of Birchen grounds with the same composed directness with which she had entered. Clara sat at the small back table for 3 minutes without moving, while the rain came down outside, and Daphne pretended with extraordinary effort to be very busy rearranging the pastry display. Then Clara stood up, went back to the counter, and tied her apron strings. But the coffee Sylvia had left behind was still steaming, and Clara's hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady, because it had just occurred to her, fully, inescapably, with the clarity of something you know the moment before you allow yourself to know it, that she was not simply enjoying the morning conversations at table 4. She had been waiting for them. The morning after Sylvia's visit, Nathaniel arrived at 7:14 as always, and Clara brought his coffee and croissant as always, and nothing on the surface of things had changed, but something underneath had shifted in a way she couldn't quite name, like furniture rearranged in a dark room, everything in a slightly different place than her body expected it to be. She did not tell him his sister had come. She wasn't sure why exactly. It wasn't deception, or at least she didn't think it was. It was more that Sylvia had come on her own terms, for her own reasons, and had not asked Clara to report back. The visit felt like something private, the way certain conversations are private, not because they contain secrets, but because they belong to a specific moment and person and don't transfer easily into other contexts. What she did do, without fully deciding to, was pay attention differently. She noticed that he smiled more than she had initially registered. Not broadly, not often, but in small, precise moments. When she said something that caught him off guard, when the elm tree did something interesting in the wind, when Gerald's voice carried across the cafe with some pronouncement about the weather or local politics, and Nathaniel's mouth would curve slightly, as if the world's ordinary comedy was something he had recently rediscovered. She noticed that he always arrived with paper and left with it too, but that the papers changed. Legal documents early in the week, handwritten notes midweek, and on Fridays she had started to look, something that appeared to be personal correspondence. Letters, written in the same dense, precise hand she had seen in the margins of documents months ago. She never asked who he was writing to, but she thought about it. She noticed that when their conversations went somewhere real, when one of them said something that landed with weight, he would go still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. His ordinary stillness was composed. This other stillness was like the moment before something moves. On the Friday of that week, 8 days after Sylvia's visit, the thing she had been quietly bracing for arrived without warning. The cafe was moderately busy, a steady mid-morning flow, not overwhelming, when a man came in that Clara had never seen before. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set in a way that suggested former athleticism, with silver-streaked hair and the particular confidence of someone who entered every room expecting it to rearrange itself around him. He scanned the cafe once, saw table 4, and walked toward it with the directness of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Nathaniel looked up. The change in him was immediate and complete. Clara, who was behind the counter making an oat milk latte, saw it from across the room, the way his entire body went still in a different way than she had ever seen, rigid rather than composed, the papers in his hand held at a slight angle, as if he had forgotten he was holding them. The man sat down across from Nathaniel without being invited. Clara finished the latte, slid it across the counter, and moved to the far end where she could observe table 4 without appearing to. She told herself this was standard professional awareness, knowing what was happening in her section. She told herself this with moderate conviction. She could not hear what they were saying. The cafe noise was enough to blur the words at that distance, but she could read the shape of the conversation. The other man was doing most of the talking, leaning forward slightly, his expression calibrated to something between sincerity and pressure. Nathaniel was listening with the particular closed stillness of someone who has heard versions of this before and is measuring the current version against what he already knows. After perhaps 12 minutes, Nathaniel set his papers on the table with a flat, final precision and said something short. The other man's expression shifted, a flicker of something that was not quite surprise and not quite anger, but adjacent to both. He said something else. Nathaniel shook his head once, stood, and left $40 on the table for a coffee and croissant that had cost $8. He walked directly to the counter. "I'm sorry," he said. He didn't explain for what. "I need to leave earlier than usual today." "Of course," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, that focused, considering look, and then seemed to make a decision. That was Robert Finch. Clara kept her expression neutral. "Okay," she said. "He wants back into the company." Nathaniel's voice was even, but she could hear the effort it was costing him. He has a proposal. An investment that he says requires my infrastructure and my capital and his contacts. He paused. He says it would be worth it to both of us to put the past aside. What do you think? Clara asked. I think, Nathaniel said slowly, that the last time I trusted Robert Finch's judgment about what would be worth it, I lost something I can't quantify on a balance sheet. He stopped. I haven't decided. You don't have to decide today, Clara said. No, he agreed, I don't. He picked up his coat from where he had draped it over the counter stool, and then, with the same directness he applied to everything, would you have dinner with me tonight? The question landed in the space between them so cleanly that for a moment Clara wasn't sure she had heard it correctly. Dinner, she said. Yes. He held her gaze. Not as a thank you, not as anything other than what it is. He paused. I'd like to spend time with you somewhere other than this table. Clara thought about Sylvia's words. He doesn't know what he's walking toward. He's not the kind of man who lets himself know things like that before he's ready. She thought about the feeling she had been carrying for weeks, the one she had been careful not to examine too directly. She thought about wanting something clearly. Yes, she said. I'd like that. Something in his face changed in a way she hadn't seen before, a loosening of something carefully held. 7 o'clock, he said. I'll send the address. He left. The door closed behind him. Gerald, who had apparently been conducting surveillance from his counterstool, said without turning around, Finally. Clara put both hands flat on the counter and took a breath. The restaurant he had chosen was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for somewhere intimidating, the kind of place with lighting so low and prices so high that the menu felt like a test. Instead, the address led her to a small Italian place on the east side of the river, the kind that had been in the same family for 30 years, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and bread that arrived in a paper bag. It was, she thought, the birch and grounds of restaurants. He was already there when she arrived at a corner table with a candle in a wine bottle, looking, for the first time since she had known him, slightly uncertain, not anxious, just uncertain, in the way of someone who has stepped outside a familiar structure and is recalibrating. You found it, he said. I did. She sat down across from him. You like places like this. I like places that aren't trying to be something they're not, he said. The dinner lasted 3 hours. They talked in the way that people talk, when they have been building toward a conversation for months, and finally arrived at it, easily and seriously at the same time, without the performative quality of a first date, because in all the ways that mattered, it wasn't one. She knew about Vale and Robert Finch and the Van Eyck reproduction. He knew about art history and the rain and the relationship that had ended quietly in a way that was somehow harder than if it had ended loudly. It was over the second glass of wine that he told her the rest of the story about Robert. He didn't just leave the company, Nathaniel said, turning his glass slowly. He took a client, a major one, someone I had built a relationship with over 7 years. Took the client and the relationship and the deal that was about to close and structured it through a competing firm he had set up 6 months before he resigned. He had been planning it for half a year while I trusted him completely. He set the glass down. The financial damage was recoverable. What wasn't? He stopped. The trust, Clara said. The friendship, he said. I had never had many close friends. I'm not... He paused. I'm not someone who opens easily. It costs me something. And Robert knew that, and he used it, and so the lesson I took from it was that the cost wasn't worth paying. Clara looked at him across the candlelight. And now? He met her eyes. I'm reconsidering the lesson. Later, when they were standing outside on the sidewalk with the Portland night around them and the river somewhere beyond the buildings, he told her something that made her understand the full shape of the morning he had asked her to sit with him. I was going to stop coming to the café, he said. Last October, I had decided that the routine had become avoidance. A way of feeling like I was part of something without actually being part of anything. He looked at the street. And then you said something about the tree. And that changed it, Clara said. You noticed the tree, he said. And then you noticed me. He said it simply, without drama. That's not a small thing. Not for someone who had spent a year being invisible by choice. Clara thought about 3 years of watching her own life from a slight distance, about waiting for something to want clearly, about the specific disorienting feeling of being genuinely seen by someone when you have forgotten that it was possible. I noticed you a long time before the tree, she said. He looked at her, and the smile that appeared on his face then, slow, full, unhurried, was not the small, precise smile she had catalogued over months of morning observation. It was something larger and less guarded than that, something that changed the whole landscape of his face. It was, she thought, the smile Sylvia had been waiting a year to see again. He walked her to her car. At the door he paused with his hand in his coat pocket, and she could see him weighing something, the old caution against the reconsidered lesson. "Same time tomorrow," he said. It meant the cafe. It meant 7:14. It meant the table by the elm tree and the black coffee in the quiet morning. But it meant something else now too, and they both knew it. "Same time tomorrow," Clara said. She drove home through the Portland rain and sat in her parked car for a few minutes before going inside, listening to the sound of it on the roof. Not thinking about anything specific, just feeling, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, that the radius of her life had expanded into something she hadn't planned and could not yet fully see, and that this, rather than frightening her, felt exactly like something she had been waiting for. November came to Portland the way it always did, gradually and then, all at once, the last of the amber leaves stripped from the elm tree in the courtyard overnight by a wind that arrived without announcement and left the branches clean and bare against a pale sky. Clara noticed it when she opened the cafe on the first Monday of the month, standing at the window with a coffee she had made for herself before the rush began, looking at the tree that had started everything with a sentence she hadn't planned to say. It looked different without the leaves, starker, more structural. You could see the actual architecture of it, the way the branches divided and subdivided with a logic that was only visible once everything decorative had been stripped away. She thought that was probably true of most things. The week since the dinner at the Italian restaurant had moved with the quality of something both new and inevitable, the way a path feels when you realize it was always there, just obscured by the overgrowth of ordinary days. Nathaniel still arrived at 7:14. Clara still brought his coffee and croissant, but the 10 or 15 minutes at table 4 were different now, easier and more serious at once, without the careful distance that had structured the earlier conversations. They were not performing anything for each other. They were just two people learning the shape of something that had no obvious precedent for either of them. He had told Robert Finch no. He had told her about it on a Wednesday morning, briefly and without drama, the way he delivered all significant information, as if the weight of a thing didn't require elaborate handling. "I met with Robert's lawyer yesterday," he had said, pulling a small piece from his croissant. "The proposal wasn't what he represented it to be. There were liability structures that would have left me exposed in ways he conveniently hadn't mentioned." He paused. "So I declined." "How do you feel about it?" Clara had asked. He had considered this with the genuine seriousness he applied to questions that deserved it. "Lighter," he said, and then looking at her, Gerald was right about that word. Clara had laughed and he had smiled, the fuller, less guarded smile that she had first seen outside the restaurant, and that still caught her slightly off guard each time, because it changed him so completely. Gerald, when she reported this exchange to him later in carefully edited form, had been insufferably pleased with himself for the rest of the morning. What Clara had not anticipated, what arrived on a Thursday in mid-November with the same quiet unexpectedness as everything significant in her life seemed to, was the phone call from her former professor. Dr. Margaret Ellis had been Clara's advisor during her final year of her art history degree, a precise and demanding woman who had told Clara at graduation that she had one of the sharpest eyes for visual analysis she had taught in 20 years, and that she hoped Clara wouldn't waste it. Clara had thought about that sentence more times than she could count across 3 years of pulling espresso shots. She had not, however, done anything about it. The call came on her lunch break, while she was sitting in the back room of Birch and Grounds, eating a sandwich and reading. She almost didn't answer. It was an area code she didn't recognize, but something made her pick up. "Clara Bennett," Dr. Ellis said, without preamble, in the same tone she had used to open every seminar 15 years ago. "I've been thinking about you." The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and rearranged several things Clara had believed to be fixed. Dr. Ellis was now running a small foundation in Portland, something Clara had not known, having lost track of her former professor years ago, that supported emerging artists and managed a rotating educational program in partnership with 2 local museums. They needed, Dr. Ellis explained, a program coordinator, someone who understood art, understood people, and understood how to create an environment where both could exist without performing for each other. "I've been interviewing candidates for 3 months, Dr. Ellis said. Competent people, impressive resumes, nobody who made me think of that paper you wrote on light in Vermeer." A pause. "I found your name through a colleague who mentioned she'd seen you at a gallery opening last spring. I'm told you were the most interesting person in the room." Clara stared at the wall of the back room. "I work at a cafe," she said. "I'm aware," Dr. Ellis said. "Are you planning to work at a cafe for the rest of your life?" It was the most direct version of the question Clara had been asking herself for 3 years. Hearing it from the outside, in someone else's voice, made it feel less like an accusation and more like an opening. "No," Clara said, and realized as she said it that she meant it with a clarity she hadn't felt before. She told Nathaniel about it the following morning. She hadn't planned to, or rather, she had been circling it, uncertain about the particular vulnerability of sharing something this new and unformed. But he had asked, the way he sometimes did, in the easy, direct way that never felt intrusive, whether she was all right, because she seemed to be somewhere else. She told him about Dr. Ellis and the foundation and the paper on Vermeer and the 40-minute phone call. She told him about the question she had been unable to stop hearing since. "Are you planning to work at a cafe for the rest of your life?" He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was one of his great gifts, not simply patience, but the quality of attention that made the person speaking feel that what they were saying was being received fully, rather than just heard. When she finished, he said, "Are you going to take it?" "I have an interview next week," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I think I am," she said. "I think I've known since the moment she asked if I planned to stay at the cafe forever, and I said no before I'd finished thinking about it." "Good," he said, simply, without qualification. "It might mean different hours," she said. "I might not be here every morning." He held her gaze. "Clara," he said, "I was going to ask you something this week, regardless of any of this." He paused. "I'd like to see you outside of this cafe on a regular basis, not just occasionally. I'd like—" He stopped, and in the pause she could see him choosing the precise word, the way he always did. "I'd like to know what it looks like to be part of your life outside of Table 4, and I'd like you to be part of mine." The elm tree outside the window was bare now. The light came through differently without the leaves, cleaner, more direct, illuminating the courtyard in a way the amber canopy had been too beautiful to allow. "Yes," Clara said, for the second time in the story of Nathaniel Hale. Both times it had felt like the clearest thing she had ever said. The interview with Dr. Ellis's foundation took place on a Tuesday afternoon in a building near the river that smelled like old wood and linseed oil. Clara arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time looking at the pieces hung in the hallway outside the interview room. Local artists mostly, works that had been donated or were on rotating loan, nothing famous, but all of it chosen with a careful eye for what it communicated, rather than what it was worth. She got the job. Dr. Ellis called her that evening and said, "I'm going to need you to be honest with me when something isn't working and confident when you know something is right. Can you do that?" "Yes," Clara said, for the 3rd time in recent memory, and found that it came just as easily as the other 2. She told Daphne the next morning before the cafe opened. Daphne, who had been waiting for something like this in the way that people who love you wait for the thing they always knew was coming. put down the chalk she had been using on the specials board, and hugged Clara with a completeness that suggested she had been saving it up. "You're still going to come in for coffee?" Daphne said. It was not a question. "Every morning," Clara said. "Different side of the counter." Gerald took the news with the gravity of a man receiving information he had already prepared himself for. "About time," he said. "Both things." He didn't specify which both things, but his eyes moved briefly to table 4 before returning to his coffee, and Clara understood that he meant all of it: the job, the table, the shift from one version of her life to the next. On her last morning behind the counter at Birchen Grounds, Clara arrived at 6:15, made a coffee for herself, and stood at the window looking at the bare elm tree for a long time. She had given 3 weeks' notice, long enough to train the new hire, a young woman named June who was earnest and quick, and would learn the regulars' orders within a week, Clara was certain. Long enough to do the transition properly, which mattered to her. At 7:14, the door opened. Nathaniel came in, stopped when he saw her standing at the window rather than behind the counter, and something in his face moved in the small, precise way she had learned to read across months of distance, and then across a table, and then across a candle-lit dinner, and then across the ordinary days that had followed. "Last morning," he said. "Last morning," she confirmed. He looked at table 4, then at her. "Sit with me." It was the same question he had asked on a rainy Tuesday in October, when she had been a person who watched her own life from a slight distance, and he had been a man practicing the discipline of invisibility. They were not those people anymore, not entirely. They were people who had found, in a small café by a window with an elm tree, the particular thing that tends to locate itself in the last place you plan to look. A version of themselves that was braver and more open than the one they had arrived with. Clara untied her apron for the last time and laid it on the counter. She walked to table 4 and sat down across from him, not as the person who brought his coffee, not as an employee doing a kind thing on a slow morning, but simply as herself. Clara Bennett, who noticed details and loved Flemish painters, and made a joke about rain that had made a closed-off man call his sister to share something small and good. June brought 2 coffees without being asked, set them down with the careful precision of someone who was learning the weight of small gestures, and withdrew. Nathaniel wrapped both hands around his mug. Clara did the same. The morning light came through the bare branches of the elm and fell across the table between them in clean, distinct lines, the kind of light that hides nothing and softens everything. "What happens now?" Clara asked, though she already knew the broad shape of the answer. He looked at her with the full, open attention he had once rationed, like something precious that might run out, and that he had gradually, over months of Tuesday mornings and rainy Thursdays, and a dinner that lasted 3 hours, learned to give freely. "Now," he said, "we find out." Outside, the elm tree stood bare and patient in the November light, waiting, the way trees do, the way good things do, for whatever season was coming next.